Hello there and welcome back to another video here on Wrist Watch Revival. My name is Marshall. Thank you so much for coming along. This time on the bench, we've got a watch I think that is kind of part of the reason why I started this channel. It's because I wanted to be able to buy watches off of eBay, vintage watches that maybe weren't working, and bring them back to life. Get them on somebody else's wrist or my own wrist and get a little piece of history back into circulation. And that's exactly what we have here. This is a watch that I bought off of eBay for $35. It's listed as non-running. And as you can see, it has various claims around the back, water protected and anti-magnetic. It's from a brand called Ancora that I've never heard of before, but that's not atypical for Swiss watch industry of this time period, which would be likely late 50s for a piece like this. As you can see, I'm trying to wind it up and nothing's happening. And that's fairly typical as well for old watches like this, nothing working. And it's going to mean some troubleshooting for us as we have to sort through, figure out why it's not running, if we can repair it, and if we can get this thing looking good and running well again and back on somebody's wrist. You can see the strap. It looks actually like it may be the original strap. This is some seriously old school leather work here. And as you can see, it's torn up. The end of it's ripped so that the buckle can't stay on. And it looks like somebody may have used a paper clip or a piece of rod wire or something to make a lug, which is resourceful of them, but not really the best way to do it. So let's start by taking this strap off. This end actually has a proper spring bar. Spring bars are a very, very simple device that has springs inside of tubed piece of metal that pushes out. It basically means that they can't come off. They're generally very, very reliable. But as you can see, it looks like it may have broken on this end. So they replace it with this, I don't know, paper clip or something. So I'm going to use these pliers to try to straighten out one end of it so that I can remove it. It's pretty handy that this has what they call drilled lugs. You can see the lugs. Those are the two protruding parts that hold the strap on the watch. They're drilled through. And yeah, there we go. We can remove this, whatever this is that was holding the strap on this whole time. And we'll take that away. The strap's pretty cool, but as you can see, it's very shrunken. It used to be the full width of the lugs, and now it's not, and it's also broken, so we'll have to get rid of it, unfortunately. I'm going to use this rubber ball to remove the back. You'd be surprised how often a simple rubber ball like this will actually just take the back off. I do have a case back removal tool for when it's really stuck. But let's get our first look inside this watch as we work our way through and try to figure out how to fix it and get it back into circulation. Movement looks pretty good straight away. Let's see if the balance wheel spins. Actually, it does. That's a very good sign as well. That's a very typical breaking point for a movement, and it can be pretty tricky to fix. So the fact that it spins is a relief. 35 bucks for this thing. If we can get, you know, a cool vintage watch out of it, I mean, that's really what I wanted to do when I first started this hobby. I've kind of graduated to working on these type of watches that I find on eBay, but also working on other people's watches, which I find particularly meaningful as well, you know, when it's a family member's watch or something like that. But there's still room on my bench for the occasional eBay find, and this is one of them. Taking a look at those hands, kind of interesting though. That's some very dark lume that we see there. And when you see lume that dark, it could be an indicator that these could have been lumed. Lume is short for luminous material. That's the glow in the dark part of the hands. They could have been lumed with radium. And if that's the case, these are radioactive. And they're quite radioactive. The half-life is what it's called. That's, you know, how often it takes for the radioactive material to become half as radioactive as it is 1,600 years for radium. So for the purposes of you and I, unless there's some pretty great inventions that happen in the next few years, it's real radioactive because these only go back to the 40s and 50s. And what that means is that you have to be careful. So I'm taking some precautions you can't see on the video, but I'm wearing a mask. I've got a well-ventilated area. And now we can continue. I'll actually check to see if it's actually radium a little bit later, I think. So first we can start by removing the cannon pinion. I've got that handy tool there. I also got that tool off of eBay. It's funny, I used to use eBay all the time, you know, kind of back in the day for all types of things. And I kind of went away from it. And when I got back into watches, And I was like, I wonder if eBay's still a thing. And it turns out it very much is. You can find so much great watch stuff on there, old tools that you can refurbish or even just use, watches, watch parts. It's really fundamental to the hobby. I would not be able to do this without eBay. So I'm really glad it's still here, still working well too. Okay, we'll start off by removing the balance complete. That's what we call that whole part that I just took off. It's actually made up of multiple parts. Primarily, it's made up of the balance bridge, the balance wheel, the balance spring. Those are kind of the main parts. There's actually even more parts within that, but those are the main parts. And two of those parts, the wheel and the spring, are very, very fragile. So I like to take it off first. Now we can get into this movement as well and start taking off this train wheel bridge. This goes all the way across the top and middle part of the movement, but it comes off nicely. That'll give us the ability to take off these upper train wheels. The Swiss watch industry around this time, this is a very typical build. And what I mean by that is that, like, in this brand was Ancora. I don't know anything about them, but there are many Swiss watch brands that are very similar to this one, that you'll find them on eBay and stuff that are no longer in business. But what they would do is the Swiss watch industry was built around the idea of specialization. So there would be a company that would make cases for the watches, and then another company that would make hands, and another that would make dials, and then another that would make movements, and then maybe even a few more that would make specialty parts for the movement or within the movement or a module or something like that. And if you wanted to start a company, what you could do is you could not have to manufacture any of your own stuff. Go to these companies in Switzerland and say, hi, I'd like a case for this watch to this specification. And they would say, okay. They would make you a bunch of cases, and you'd say, you go to the movement manufacturer and say, give me 50 of those. And then you would eventually be able to make these watches, and they would be Swiss made. They say Swiss on the dial. They say Swiss on the movement, which, it has a name recognition to it and a reputation for quality. And then you would have your own Swiss watch brand, and you could sell them as such. The ones that didn't make it through the quartz crisis in the 60s and 70s, if you don't know what that is, it's a really interesting story. I'll give you the super short version, but basically when quartz, that's the battery powered watches, came out, the Swiss watch industry as it was, the ones that made mechanical watches like this, basically plummeted. And everybody thought that the whole world was going to go to quartz and that these mechanical watches were obsolete, so they all jumped ship. As it turns out, they were somewhat right. But there's still a very healthy market for mechanical watches because of their charm, because it's kind of a marrying of design and art, if you will. And so they ended up being able to stick around in the way that they are today. But there was a big readjustment around the 60s or 70s, and a lot of companies disappeared. Their watches, their history, everything just disappeared at once. And this is a good example of that. Tons of brands that you can find a whole heck of a lot of watches, but they didn't make a lot of their own stuff. Like this movement was not made by them, as an example. This is what we call an off-the-shelf movement, meaning you just walk in, say, give me 50 of them, and off you go. The good news about that is that there was you can either find the same or similar movements in a ton of different watches from the 30s or 40s all the way up through the 60s and 70s, and even after that in many cases. And as a watchmaker, that's pretty handy because you might even work on the same exact movement from two completely different watch brands. It's also worth noting that this phenomenon was not exclusive to brands that you've never heard of. This was exactly the same model that many of the top brands used, including, Rolex. Absolutely. They used movements from other companies for a really long time. In fact, all the way up until the early 2000s before they started doing what they call in-house movements. And that's where they make them themselves. Rolex is an interesting example because now they do everything themselves. I mean, they bring in bars of gold and metal, melt them down into the parts. They're about as vertically integrated as you can possibly get. Them and Seiko are kind of the two that are known to be the most so, but there's even a push for the mid-size and smaller brands to make their own parts and movements as much as they can. And people find that more special. And since these watches, these days, the current crop of watches that you buy are not purchased for the reasons of practicality, being more special can add value. Okay, this is a big moment here. I got the whole watch disassembled there. As you can see, a very straightforward movement. It came right apart, but let's take a look at the mainspring because my hunch is that it's broken. Oh, it is? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Very, very broken. So there we go. So we were right. It was a pretty strong indicator. Oh, wow. Looks like it actually snapped in two parts here. Boy, this is one of those old school mainsprings as well. This watch is quite old. I would date this now to the 40s. This is like a blued steeled mainspring. And these were the previous generation of mainsprings. They're wound in a pure circular fashion and they're made of metal that is actually quite prone to breaking over time. As you can see, this one actually broke in two spots there. And as I take this spring out, you'll see the shape of it is just round. It's just a straight up spiral. After this, new technology was invented that used a much stronger alloy of metal. They actually got a little ahead of themselves and called it an unbreakable mainspring in the marketing for the replacement springs. They're not quite that, but compared to these, they are. They also changed the shape of them because the metals were able to handle being bent much harder. And they're actually more like a spiral with an S attached to it now, rather than just a ring. So that's pretty cool. Take a quick look at the case here. Looks like a pretty straightforward case from the era. Yeah, that crystal has definitely seen better days. I love the wear on it. Let's see if it'll come out. Yeah, there we go. But unfortunately, I don't want to leave it like this. It does make it harder to see the dial. And the dial is one of the things that I'm excited about for this watch because it has this cool like kind of waffle pattern on it. As you can see, this watch hasn't been cleaned in a long time. Ugh. Yeah. Just kind of gross. There's just a lot of dirt and debris from somebody having just worn this around for a long time. On one hand, I think it's really cool that somebody wore it, but on the other hand, it's like, well, let's clean up the mess. And there's quite a bit here too. You can see it gets attracted in between the lugs and stuff. But the cool part is that it's actually really easy to clean. I'm just using a piece of pegwood to take off kind of the big chunks, and then I'll throw it in the ultrasonic cleaner, which is a non-abrasive way to clean it. It just uses a mild detergent and ultrasonic action. Ooh, look at this. There's an old school gasket in here too. Let's take this out. Oh yeah. It feels so good to take this little gasket out. You know, if you've ever gotten like a new appliance at home that has that sticker on it that you have to take off the front, that's what it feels like. It's so good, except for it's probably been 50 years. Okay, a quick measurement here on the crystal says that it's about 26 millimeters. So I'll put it in order for that. And I always order an extra size bigger and sometimes an extra size smaller. If I end up with extra crystals, no problem. I'll probably use them down the line. Also, they're very inexpensive. That means though that we can put the watch movement into the watch cleaning machine, which I'm doing right here. This will take it through a 3-step cycle plus drying before it's done. And while it's doing that, I did want to mention that I've got a Patreon for this channel. Patreon's a way that you can give back to the creators that you love. You know, we've got this really cool economy now where small creators like me can make the type of content that I want to make. I want to make a show about wristwatches. That would never fly, you know, on cable or on the television or whatever, but you're here and I'm here and we can make these things. And if you like what I'm doing, you want to support me, it's patreon.com/wristwatchrevival. Thank you so much for your support. And thanks to all my patrons over there as well. Okay, here's the watch all finished up on the bench, looking nice and clean and pretty and ready to go. No, it's not running. I just blew some air on the on the wheel there just to show you how freely it actually spins once it's been fully cleaned. The cool part is that this is before it being oiled as well, and you can see that it actually goes for a really long time. But that's the whole watch laid out, the whole movement right there. So the first thing we need to do is get this mainspring. And I've ordered a new one. What you can do is measure the mainspring yourself, or in this case, I was able to look it up online by the movement number, and that'll tell you the measurements for it. So once you do that, you get the mainspring in this little holder. And as you can see, I can just set it over the mainspring barrel and then gently push it in with this pointer stick. One little tip is that that metal ring around it that keeps it in place, that always has a color on the top, and then it's just unpainted on the bottom. You see it's silver on the bottom. Always put it with the color facing up, and that'll put it in the proper orientation. You can put a mainspring in backwards. And if you do, you have to remove it, put it in forwards again. And sometimes it can take until you've got the watch already reassembled before you realize it, in which case, yeah, you've wasted a bit of your time. Okay, now we can put the arbor back in, a little bit of oil on the top where it contacts this cap. And now I can put the lid on. I've got a little plastic tool here that I got off of eBay to help secure the lid, and that thing is ready to go. And with that done, I can now put it back in the movement as well. And we can begin reassembly. A little bit of oil here on this wheel before I put it in. There we go. And as you can see, there's a small, just 1 jewel bridge that goes across. And a quick check before you screw it down. If you are looking to get into the hobby of watchmaking, and by the way, I do highly, highly recommend it, especially if you like bringing things back to life. And if you're kind of a mechanically minded person, it's really, really awesome. Always make sure that all the wheels are in place before you screw down the screws, or you risk damage. I have made that mistake before, and it sucks. I don't recommend it. Okay. Now I can put a little bit of oil on my oiler here, and if I push down and lift up just slightly, the oil will actually go in between the barrel and that bridge. It kind of seeps into place so that it can stay lubricated over the course of this next run for this watch. This is called the click spring. This is a very fine spring, and so I have to be careful with it. But I've learned since I started this hobby that you always want to keep something to stabilize the spring. You don't want to try to put that in and risk having it fly away, because I'm telling you right now, those things are born to fly. They are in a cage here, but when they're free, they're looking to jump away. Okay, now we can put the click spring and the click, or excuse me, the click and the click screw into place and just make sure it's working all right. These type of movements are a real pleasure to work on. These have been refined over the years. And they were meant to be serviced as well. So it ends up being a pretty straightforward operation for the most part. I've never worked on this particular movement, but like I said, they're so familiar after having worked on a bunch of Swiss watches from these kind of brands that don't exist anymore, and they all use similar movements. But it's great, you know, as you go deeper and deeper into a hobby, you start to build up that kind of experience where things start to click for you quicker and quicker. You know, people ask all the time, how do you remember where all the parts go, right? How do you remember where the screws go? Because you just throw them in a basket. And it is crazy how much our brain can adapt to this type of stuff. I mean, for a movement like this now, I can just lay it out and I can just look at it and go, that's probably that. I mean, I know all the parts for sure. The only question is which screw goes where. And I can tell you almost every screw. And I would bet probably on a movement like this, I could just say each screw, where it goes and what it's for. Now, on more complicated movements, that's not true. There's still times when you have to kind of remember, okay, I need to have a screw that, you know, because there are differences between them, by the way. They're not all the screws. They look the same when they're laid out, but they're actually not. Some of them have a shoulder. Some of them are wider, flatter. Some of them even have like a polished top versus a flat top. And sometimes that's a clue about which part of the movement they go in. But it's also worth noting here that, you know, I happen to have a very nice recording of every single watch that I take apart. And if I ever get stuck, I can just look at that. It's also the way you should do it, by the way. Of course, you don't need to put the effort that I do into the video part of this. I've kind of, that's really important to me for the channel so that you can see what I'm doing and so that you can really kind of understand the beauty and the engineering that goes behind these. And so the camera work was really important to me. But, you can just set up your phone and point it at the first watches that you take apart. And you can make a video too, so that if you do get stuck, you can go back and at least have a reference point. When I first started, I started taking photos. And then pretty quickly, I was like, wait a minute, I have all these cameras because I do content in other spaces too, besides this one. And I was like, well, I just got this nice camera. I'll just point it at the dang thing. And I started doing that. And then, of course, my brain started working and I was like, well, this is a pretty good video, actually. And I was like, I could probably talk over this video and explain what I'm doing. And, next thing you know, I'm buying another camera and figuring out lighting and, and now we're here. So there you go. I guess it all worked out. All right. Getting back on to this reassembly. This is the other side of the movement now. And I'm working on the keyless works. We've already got the train wheel and everything the train wheels and everything all set into place on the other side. So that necessitates flipping the movement over. This is where the big guns come out too. Starting to use some grease. That's our heavier oil there, the red one. And whoops, I put a little bit too much on. Yeah, okay. So what you want to do when you put too much on is take a little bit of Radico and just gently remove the excess oil. It's actually not great to have extra oil. You might think to yourself, well, why not? Like, what's the big deal, right? Like you get a little extra oil. I mean, I'm not putting so much that it's going to be coming out of the watch or getting onto the dial or something, right? And you would be right. It is not that much. If you're putting that much on, then you got bigger problems. You need to, read that manual or whatever, because I have seen that. In fact, there's videos on this channel where people have just doused the thing in oil, and that is really not good. But using even just a little bit too much oil can actually have detrimental effects as well, as it can actually seep to other parts of the movement that normally wouldn't get that kind of oil. For example, if some oil gets on the hairspring, that will completely screw up the watch, just as an example. So you do want to be careful with the amount you use. Generally speaking, you actually try to use about as little as possible. I mean, not literally, but like it is a very small amount to be correct. And if you see somebody putting on a whole bunch or doing it really sloppily, then you know that they're kind of just making it up as they go. All right, so now we can continue with the keyless works here. And this is the big boy. This is the yoke spring. I mentioned how that click spring was born to fly. This is the real deal here. This is a much stronger spring, so you absolutely must stabilize it because you have to do this kind of operation that I just did there where I pull it over and kind of slide it into place. And that means that it's tensioned for that pulling time. And if you let go, it's gone. I've had that happen before. Okay, now we can put the setting lever into place. And this is kind of a tricky operation because you need to hold it in place, which I'm going to do with my index finger here, and then screw it down from the other side. And it's always just a little bit finicky to do so because you have to get the threads lined up and not have anything go flying. But there we go. Job done. And now I can put on the setting lever spring as well. And as you can see, it sets into place. That's actually a fairly common part to break. It is under significant tension, not when the watch isn't being used, but when you pull the crown. And I'll show you this in just a second here, to set it in. You know how you pull the crown out to turn it and then the hands turn? Watch this. So like that, there, that part is guided by that setting lever spring. So as you can imagine, there's a lot of tension there. And that's why we use this grease. This blue grease that I'm putting on here helps to ease the operation of that. And of course, also prevents the creation of metal shavings or wear on that spring. Again, a little bit too much oil here from me, and I'm going to use some Radico to clean it up. Okay, so with that done, we can get to the moment of truth here, put the pallet fork in. And then the only other part that we need to put on is the balance. And we're going to see if we've turned this thing into a watch that would not run into one that does run. So let's find out. First, we just need to carefully put the pallet fork in. Like another little hint talking about the screws. The screws that hold down things like the pallet fork bridge are always very, very flat. And that's because the balance wheel, which I'll show you in a minute, needs to sit on top of where that screw that I just screwed down is and spin. And so if it's stuck out, it would actually touch it. So watch where I put this down. See how it sits right on top of that screw there? If that screw stuck out, it would stop the wheel. So you know, hey, that's a really flat screw. Okay, here we go. Let's get this balance on and see if this thing will run. A new mainspring, hopefully all it needs. Ooh. Go. Oh yeah, there we go, baby. That's the one. Look at that, kicked right up. And it even looks like it's running really well straight away on top of that. Sometimes these older movements are a little sluggish to get going, but then they can kind of pick up over time or when you oil the jewels. But this one, no way. It is just up and running. That is awesome. Fantastic. So this is exactly what you want to see. And this is kind of what you hope for when you get a watch off of eBay, right? That it's something that you know how to fix, that you can get the parts for and that you can fix. Okay, now it's time to oil the jewels. The jewels on the top, if you don't know, are made out of synthetic ruby. They're not valuable in the sense of like they don't have monetary value. They're cheap to manufacture, but they're very, very important for the operation of the watch. This one, in fact, is over the escape wheel. And it has what they call a cap jewel. So I need to remove this upper cap jewel. And what you'll see is this is actually a 2-jewel setup. So the bottom one has a hole in it, just like the first 2 jewels that I've oiled. And by the way, that is the tiniest screw. So I've got to be careful. I'm going to use some Rodico to pick it up. And the top is this kind of plate. And the top of the plate is a jewel. And what that does is it allows you to put oil on that plate and then push it up against the one with the hole. And when you do that, it suspends the oil directly above the pivot. And that's exactly where the oil needs to be for maximum performance. So what we'll do is I'll show you. So this is that plate that I'm talking about. It still has the solvent in it that I just used to clean off any dried on residual oil. And now you can see it right there. And now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take just a tiny droplet of oil, whoop, right there, and put it right in the center. And now I can take this part and put it back on the watch. And do you see the droplet of oil suspended right above that pivot? Can you see it? That will stay right there. And by the way, this screw is just ludicrously small. Look at this screw. I mean, is that not just absurd? Like, oh, like it is absolutely tiny. And it doesn't look quite like that on the close-up camera shot here, but I had to show you what it looked like in my hand. So when I screw this down, it will suspend that droplet of oil right above that pivot permanently until that oil, gives out, dries up, or however you want to describe it. So there we go. Now, the only other one that I need to do is right here, and this is the cap jewel. This one actually has an interesting setup that I haven't seen before, but it's similar enough to what I have seen. It looks like both parts come out simultaneously, and this has a very similar setup to what I just did. There's a jewel with a hole in it, and then there's a cap jewel on top. And there you go. You can see them having fallen apart there. And one of those will have it. And what I'm doing here is putting them in a pretty harsh solvent that will dissolve any dried up oil, dirt, or debris that was left on it from the last time that the watch was serviced. That will give me a clean surface with which to suspend that oil and put it back on, and it'll give the watch the best chance to run the absolute best. So I'm going to do the same thing here. Just a drop of oil right there on the cap. And now I can take the whole jewel, that's HOLE jewel that goes on the bottom, and put them together. Oh, just like that. And then I can take this whole setup and put it back in the watch. This is obviously very finicky work, and you have to be quite careful with it. Okay, there we go. And now I can just turn this back into place. Again, being as gentle. Oh, is that a hair? Kind of. That's actually a fiber that I just found on the side of that. I wouldn't be able to see that without the microscope, but might as well take it out. Even a fiber like that, if it were to get underneath this cap jewel, can actually slow down the watch pretty significantly. That one wasn't going to get in there. Okay, let's put it on the time grapher now that we're done oiling up all the jewels and everything and see how it runs. Holy smokes. 0 seconds a day rate. That means that the watch is not gaining or losing any time it has healthy amplitude and a good beat error. That is about the best case that we could hope for. What that actually makes me think is that this was one of the original mainspring on the watch, and when it broke, they threw it in a drawer because it still had the original strap, and this is probably the original crystal as well. Speaking of, let's replace it. I've got this Rober press here. Rober's a French company that makes these presses. This is easily my favorite way to replace a crystal. There's a few different tools that you can use, but I think this is the best one. And all you have to do is squeeze it down so that the crystal gets shrunk a little bit, put the case around it, and then simply relieve the pressure. The crystal will expand into the case like this. And now we've got this nice new crystal, a little bit of dust under it, but I'll make sure that that's cleaned up before we put the watch back together. The point is, the crystal's fixed. Now, taking a look, and this old gasket that I took out has to be worn out. It's kind of a flat gasket, so I've got another one that I'll use to replace it to give it a chance to be waterproof. It says it's waterproof on the back, but it's not. These older watches are never waterproof. In fact, they never were. They were just a lot looser with what they were able to say on these type of watches. But I mean, you will not find a watch that says waterproof, right? Now it's not kosher to even put that on the dial or on anywhere on the case because it's not true. They are water resistant to extreme depths in some case, but not waterproof. Taking a look at the crown, I don't hate this crown, but it looks like the plating has worn off on it. And so I think I'm going to just replace it. This tends to get worse over time once the plating's gone. And I'd like this watch to last for a while. I'm also not a huge fan of this style of crown with the kind of domed piece on it. I don't hate it or anything, but I think I'm going to replace it with a more traditional shaped crown. So all I need to do is take off the old crown. And now I'm going to use a little bit of what we call Loctite. If you've ever used this, this has a lot of applications in automotive and industrial use. Basically, you put it on the threads of something that you're going to bolt in or screw in, and it'll make sure that those don't unlock. You can get varying degrees of Loctite. This is actually the least holding, so you can take the crown off again someday. But they go all the way up to, like, if you put this on, you're not going to get this back apart. Okay, so taking a look at the dial and hands, I am curious to see if this is radium. So I bought a Geiger counter. So let's see what it says. We'll put it on the dial and hands and see what the reading says. It's going up, going up, going up. And after some time, I come back and yeah, it's at 193 CPM. And that reads as high. Now, I bought this Geiger counter not to get an actual count. I just want to know, is this radium or not? And what I did is I tested it on a bunch of my watches. And all of the ones that were radium, including this one, and yes, it is radium, were up in that 190 to 200 and something range. And all the ones that weren't were around 20, like 15 to 20. So it lets me check. I don't really like... That type of Geiger counter doesn't even read the primary type of radiation, which is alpha radiation that you need for radium. But that's not what's relevant to me. I'm not trying to do scientific studies with it. I just want to know, is this radium or not? And it is. They use radium right there on the hands and on the dial around the lume plots around the outside. And yeah, stuff super dangerous. It is generally considered relatively safe to wear, mainly because the alpha radiation that it gives off basically can be stopped by the crystal. Your skin will stop it. Anything that it basically touches, it kind of stops it because it's for not having time to explain it enough and not knowing it enough, it's a big type of radiation. Basically, the atoms or whatever it is that are coming off are large and they can't pass through small things. That said, it's a personal choice on whether you want to wear or use a watch with radium or not. Again, they're generally considered safe enough to use, but the main risk is actually breathing in or ingesting some of the radium. So I always wear a mask and make sure I use a ventilated area when I'm working on them. And I feel like they're fine. I'm not really thrilled about it, but I don't think that there's any like huge potential danger. But again, everybody has to make their own decision on that. Okay, let's get this watch back together. Now we can put the crown with it, the stem with its new crown on it back in as well as the retaining ring for the movement. And let's see how it looks. Huh. Okay. Well, shoot. Interesting. All right, let's put the back on here, but I feel like that crown might be sticking out too much, which could just be a difference in the size length of the crown. Ooh, it looks really good though. But yeah, that crown is definitely sticking out too much. You can see it doesn't go in all the way. So unfortunately, we're not quite done yet. I need to adjust the length of the stem. Not by very much though. It looks like, boy, 1/3 of a millimeter maybe? It's not very much, but we have to go back the same exact way that I did it before. So we'll take off the crown, and now I can take a file and I can just gently remove just a little bit of material. And this, of course, is the type of situation where you want to do a little bit, test it, a little bit, test it, a little bit, until you get it where you want it for the most part. And for this one, I think I'll end up having to do it about 3 or 4 times. But I do want to show you what the watch looks like when it's finished. So let's just take a look-see here. There we go. That looks pretty good. I could even take a little tiny bit more off of that crown. I'll do that as well. But for now, this looks just fine. And that's a cool watch, right? Like the dial on this thing is really, really neat. It has that inner section that's kind of waffled, which I really, really like. And I also got a new watch strap for this watch. And yes, I got new spring bars for it as well. So no paper clips anymore for this thing. Anti-magnetic, water protected. We'll see about all that. I don't think that that's actually the case, and I would not recommend bringing this watch into the water nor near a particularly strong magnetic field, but take a look at it. It is really cool. Like I said, that dial is really my favorite part of it. You can see that pattern on the inner and outermost rings of it, and it looks really, really great. You can actually also see where the radium burned the dial a little bit. Do you see that? That's where the hands were for all the years that it was just sitting. And you can see what time it was when that watch stopped, because that radium actually changed the color of the dial underneath it a little bit. Wow. What a cool little watch though, and a fun project. Thank you so much for joining me on yet another watchmaking journey. I'm always really happy that you choose to join me for it. If you want to find me on Instagram, I'm over there at wristwatch_revival, where I'll post pictures, some pictures from my watch collection or in between project updates, that type of stuff. It's always a great place to stop over and say hi. Just wanted to say thanks again for hanging out with me. We'll see you next time.